Hello, I'm Dr. Michael Coffman, and I've been involved in environmental research, specifically ecosystem analysis, classification, and management, for over 25 years. And it was during the 1980s, when I was leading a multi-million-dollar research effort, that I became aware that the environmentalists in the environmental community was implementing something far more than just protecting the environment. They were implementing a huge agenda that had nothing to do with protecting the environment. Now, I'm not talking about the rank and file environmentalist that is concerned primarily about clean air, clean water, and our health. We all want those things. What I'm talking about is an agenda that goes far beyond that. And as I began to research this, I went into a state of shock as I realized that this agenda was leading towards establishing a world government. After researching it for a number of years, I decided to leave my job and do this full time, and have produced many books and videos since that time explaining exactly what's going on. If you're interested in exactly what the environmental community is doing and how they're doing it, I would recommend getting this book, Saviors of the Earth, which I wrote a couple of years ago, but it's as valid today as it was when I wrote it. It will explain exactly what happened with the environmental agenda. Tonight we're going to do something a little bit differently, however. We're going to be looking at how this global concept of global governance, as the United Nations likes to say, is being implemented, what's been happening in recent years and months, and how God seems to be intervening and slowing the process down in a miraculous way. We're going to be looking primarily at three things: the earth religion, in which we are establishing a new earth concept of religion based in what is known as pantheism. And in the year 2002, there was a major meeting that was going to be advancing this called Earth Dialogues. We're going to be talking about that particular meeting tonight. We're also going to be talking about global financial control. What has been happening over the last couple of years in establishing an international monetary system and establishing the financial architecture for the world and having global governance. There was a meeting called the Conference on Financing for Sustainable Development that will also happen in the year 2002 that goes towards the major implementation of this new financial architecture. Finally, we're going to be talking about the control of land use, because it's the control of land use, or the control of property rights, that allows this global governance to actually exert total and absolute control over you and I. And as a consequence, it's extremely important, and it's a culminating meeting of about 20 years, 30 years worth of work in the United Nations to bring about United Nations control over each and every one of us. And there was, again, another major meeting, the culminating meeting, in which all this was supposed to come together, called the World Summit on Sustainable Development, that occurred in September of the year 2002. And we'll be looking at that as well. The first one is Earth Dialogues. Earth Dialogues was held in Lyons, France on February 21st to the 23rd, the year 2002. It was sponsored so that we can implement what is known as the Earth Charter. The Earth Charter is this pantheistic document that was established and finished about a year and a half ago, and will literally control every aspect of our lives, as we'll look at in a moment. The primary sponsors of the Earth Dialogues is Mikhail Gorbachev and Maurice Strong. And Mikhail Gorbachev, as many of you probably recognize and remember, was the premier of the Soviet Union until it collapsed in 1991. And the Soviet Union, along with himself, was probably one of the greatest polluters and one of the greatest destroyers of the environment the world has ever known. And yet he has become Mr. Green, actually profiting tremendously since he has left as premier of the Soviet Union. Mikhail Gorbachev at the Rio +5 conference in 1997 says that we have to restrain and restrict activities that are destructive of nature. If we don't, it is quite clear that at some point nature will just have to live without us. We should find our place in nature, so conflict between the biospheres and its laws on the one hand, and the current way mankind operates on the other hand. This is Mikhail Gorbachev, one of the greatest environmental destroyers of all time, basically telling us that we have to make some dramatic changes in our lives. The second person, Maurice Strong. Now, Maurice Strong, for many of you that know him, has a very colorful background. He was a Canadian industrialist. He came from a very impoverished background in his childhood and became one of the leading figures in the international community and was the Secretary General of the first Earth Summit in 1972 in Stockholm, Sweden, and went on to become the first director of the brand new United Nations Environmental Program in 1972, and attended and led many United Nations during the meetings during the intervening time until 1992, in which he was the Secretary General of the second Earth Summit, where the various environmental treaties were introduced, and the procedure and the process was very much advanced in implementing this control of land and implementing the concept of pantheism in the way we behave around the earth. Maurice Strong, during his opening comments at the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, said that it is clear that current lifestyles and consumption patterns of the affluent middle class involving high meat intake, consumption of large amounts of frozen and convenience foods, use of fossil fuels, appliances, home and workspace air conditioning, and suburban housing are not sustainable. Now, I want you to know that we're emphasizing the point of which he says that they are not sustainable. And of course, he's taking direct aim at the middle class, primarily of America, but also of the first world nations as a whole, and basically saying that what we do is not sustainable and we're going to have to make radical changes. He goes on to say that a shift is necessary towards lifestyles less geared to environmentally damaging consumption patterns. Now, just what does this mean? The Earth Charter itself said in 1997 through 1999 on its website that the Earth Charter is the articulation of a spiritual vision, a pantheistic vision, that reflects universal spiritual values, whose objective is to implement a radical change in humanity's attitudes and values. Now, again, I want to emphasize the concept of a radical change. As we go through tonight's presentation, you're going to become aware of the fact that this is, in fact, going to involve a radical change in what you and I can do, our lifestyles, our standard of living, and a whole potpourri of other things that will change very dramatically if they actually implement this concept called sustainable development and global governance. The Earth Charter goes on to say that it's a people's charter that serves as a universal code of conduct for ordinary citizens, educators, business executives, scientists, and religious leaders. Now, this is a pantheistic concept of how we should live, and yet it is going to be universal in the context that everyone, you and I, even pastors of Christian churches, are going to be forced to adhere to this pantheistic dogma. And we will not be able to have churches, above ground churches, legitimate churches sanctioned by the government under this new concept of earth religion. And we need to be aware that if that is in fact going to happen, the church is going to have to move underground. Now, the Earth Charter itself has been placed on papyrus in what is called the Ark of Hope. Now, the Ark of Hope is a fake imitation of the Ark of the Covenant during Moses' time when he brought the Ten Commandments from Mount Sinai into Israel and eventually put them into the temple. This is supposed to duplicate that, including even the rods and so forth, but it in fact is something that is just a fake in the context of what it means spiritually. The Earth Charter itself, if we look at it very closely, in the preamble, it says that we stand at a critical moment in Earth's history, a time when humanity must choose its future. These people are not joking. They basically think that we have to make this radical change. This is a critical moment in Earth's history. If we do not change, we are literally going to destroy Earth and us along with it. That's what they believe, and that's how they are approaching this particular problem. Humanity is a part of a vast evolving universe, Earth, Our home is alive with a unique community of life. When we look at this, realize that their concept of evolution, as it says here, goes far beyond what Darwin proposed and actually is part of what they believe to be reincarnation. We'll be looking at that in just a moment in a little more depth. But they look at evolution and reincarnation as being one and the same. Earth, our home, is alive. They don't look at Earth as just being the home of plants and animals and so forth, as we'll see in a moment. But they think that Earth itself is alive. It's a sentient or a living being that has knowledge and is able to direct us in the goddess Gaia and other belief systems. The Ark of Hope, if we look at it very carefully, in the top picture there depicts people, one in a wheelchair, and animals. There's a lion actually in front of the wheelchair, showing that we all live in harmony one with another. The bottom picture of the Ark shows both above ground animals and so forth, as well as below ground, even amoebas, rocks, and so forth, that are all part of what they like to term a community. Now, what is a community? If we look at the Global Biodiversity Assessment, and this is a 1,100-page document that the United Nations said did not exist when it was when the U.S. Senate was in the process of ratifying the Convention on Biological Diversity in 1994. And in this particular document, it says that traditional or pantheistic societies tend to view themselves as members of a community that not only includes other humans, but also plants and animals, as well as rocks, springs, and pools. People are then members of a community of beings, living and non-living. So now the rock is actually elevated to a being, just like a human being, with equal rights and privileges, and we have no rights as human beings to abuse the rights of rocks. Thus, it goes on to say, rivers may be viewed as mothers, animals may be treated as kin. Now this particular document is being used, even as we speak, to write the implementing language for the Convention on Biological Diversity. It's a very dangerous concept, one in which will shift the worldview from the Western concept of Judeo-Christian ethics to one of pantheistic ethics. If we look further at the Ark of Hope, what we see is basically the wheel of life. And you can see the symbols here are based and organized primarily in a circle. And this circle is representing the wheel or the circle of life that is very much involved in the occult belief of pantheism and reincarnation, that life is a full circle and never has an end. And then on another panel of the Ark of Hope is a pyramid of animals and other sundry things that on top shows something very interesting. But before that pyramid are two crocodiles. And crocodiles in the occult are the wise ones. They're the guardians of the truth, as it were. And so we're depicting an occultish idea in the Ark of the Hope, that in which is you have the crocodiles as being the wise ones. Up on top, you have what looks to be an owl. In occult literature, the owl represents wisdom. But if you look a little bit more carefully, the wings actually take on the form of a goddess that is in the shape of a circle, which represents the earth. And what we're seeing here, of course, is planet Earth, or the goddess Gaia, that has superimposed over all of the life on planet Earth. Very occultish. And then, of course, the whole thing is organized in the form of a triangle. The triangle, again, having very occultish meaning, where you have on one leg, according to Lucis Trust, one of the most occultish organizations in America and one of the most powerful politically, it's supposed to represent the Lord Buddha. The other is the Master Dual Kul, and the bottom is the avatar of synthesis, where it all comes together, overseen by the Sun, S-U-N, of God. This is the occult meaning of all the symbolism that we're seeing in the Ark of the Hope. The Ark of the Hope, if we look at it more carefully and go back to what Al Gore wrote in his book, Earth in the Balance, where he said that the prevailing ideology of belief in prehistoric Europe and much of the world was based on the worship of a single earth goddess, who was assumed to be the fount of all life and who radiated harmony amongst all living things. Isn't that wonderful? And then he goes on to say that the last vestige of organized goddess worship was eliminated. Notice how he takes a direct shot at Christianity, eliminated by Christianity as late as the 15th century. It seems obvious that a better understanding of goddess worship could offer us new insights into the nature of the human experience. This was our vice president. This is a man who aspires to be the president of the United States, who is literally holding up goddess worship as the primary and the most important reason that we should be in existence and we should organize our civilization around it. The Ark of the Hope, just like the Ark of the Covenant, has been carried from place to place in the United States and around the world, and we're going to be coming back to it a little bit later towards the end of the video. The one thing that is clear in all of this, if we go back to the United Nations Global Biodiversity Assessment, what we find is a true disdain for Christianity. Societies dominated by Islam, and especially Christianity, have gone furthest in setting humans apart from nature and embracing a new value system that has converted the world into a warehouse of commodities for human enjoyment. In the process, nature has lost its sacred qualities. And remember, this global biodiversity assessment is being designed to be the basis and form the basis of writing the implementing language for the Convention on Biological Diversity, an international treaty. Now let's take a look at what this means biblically. In Revelation 17, 3-5, we find some interesting commentary that John wrote. He says in verse 3, "Then the angel carried me away in the spirit into the desert. There I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was covered with blasphemous names and had 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was dressed in purple and scarlet and was glittering with gold and precious stones and pearls. She had a golden cup in her hand filled with the abominable things and the filth of her adulteries. This title was written on her forehead, Mystery Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes and the abominations of the earth." Now what God was showing John when he wrote this is that this is a false religion. It's a religion based on nature worship or earth worship, just as we're seeing predominating our policy formulations today. It's one that we need to be cautious of and aware of as it develops, because it could have tremendous biblical implications. The next meeting that we're going to be looking at is the United Nations International Conference on Financing for Development that was held in Monterrey, Mexico on March 18th through the 22nd, 2002. In this meeting, it was authorized, they authorized the establishment of the process to grant United Nations access of all financial records of all nations, which basically means, of course, that the United States has to open up all its financial records to the United Nations and the global elite, so that we're so-called fully transparent. It also called for strengthening the financial regulation and the supervision of all international monetary exchanges, so that the United Nations and its financial institutions like the World Bank and the IMF will literally control the global economy. The third thing would be to develop financial standards and their implementation. In other words, we all have to change our methods of accounting and so forth to fit a global model. The fifth would be to establish an exchange rate and capital account regimes that will ultimately lead to, of course, a single monetary exchange capacity with one form of money, and to make the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, much more flexible, which basically means, according to documents within the United Nations, that this will eventually become the world's central bank pattern after the privately owned U.S. Federal Reserve. And this is privately owned, and the banking community will then be in charge of all the financial aspects of the world. Understand it from that particular perspective. They're literally looking for total economic control. Now, if you want to know more about this particular meeting, take a look or get Destiny 21st Century Towards Financial Control. It explains this particular agenda in far more detail than I'm going to be doing here tonight. There's two other things that I do want to explore a little bit more in depth tonight, and that is that they wanted to further develop the public-private partnerships and the creation of economic regions. Let's take first the look at the development of the public-private partnerships. Now, what is a public-private partnership? Basically, they're agreements between non-government organizations, governments, primarily the federal agencies and so forth, private corporations, to implement goals and agendas. How this will work is that non-government organizations provide the perceived public support. In other words, they're representing you and I. And they will serve as a watchdog role. The second would be corporations. They have the money. And the third would be the government muscle and infrastructure to make it all happen. Now, in this process, this is Albert Gore's reinventing the government that occurred in the 1990s. We're going to be taking a little bit greater look at that as we go along in this discussion here this evening. But this is, in effect, reinventing government. And notice, nowhere is there any accountability to the people in this process. And that's one of the things that is very striking in the thousands of pages of United Nations documents that we have gone through, is that there literally is no accountability to the people of the world whatsoever. It's all controlled by a group of elite. Now, the public-private partnerships works like this. It's called reinventing the government in the United States, where we have the people. The people are represented supposedly by non-government organizations. They will have control over what supposedly you and I want. This, at the same time, is going to be enforced by the government, primarily the government agencies. And finally, the multinational corporations are going to be directing all of it. Now, the thing that we need to be aware of in this particular process is that when you consider that non-government organizations are actually funded by private foundations and governments, what we're seeing here is that they're really not truly independent. And if the foundations led by the multinational corporations threaten to cut off their money, then they're going to have to be basically the pawns of the multinational corporations. And as a consequence, they're really not independent. They're not really capable of carrying out this watchdog role that they're supposed to be doing. The second is the government. Now, as we go through this particular process, you're going to see how the actual wages of the average middle American is going to decline, and decline dramatically. Therefore, the tax base is going to shrivel. And the government is going to depend more and more on taxes of actual corporations. As this happens, and if the corporations say that a certain governmental policy reduces their profits, therefore reduces taxes, they too will come under very strong influence of the multinational corporations and be basically under their thumb. Now, the public-private partnerships are a top-to-bottom arrangement. We have it at the international level, we have it at the national level, and we will have it at the local level, as we'll see later in the video. All of which dictates to you and I what we can do and what we can't do. There will be really very little choice that we have, because we no longer have a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Now let's just go back to this concept of what I call the unholy trinity: multinational corporations, government, and non-governmental organizations, and take a little bit greater detailed look at it. What we have now is a group of international laws that are going to limit us as to what we can do on the one side. On the other side, we have a new earth-based religion called pantheism being put into place that is going to limit our activities on that score, because we have to put Mother Nature first before we actually meet humankind's needs. And then finally, sustainable development is the platform upon which it's all built. And what we have now is a nice little package in which we are literally hamstrung, in which we can no longer have the freedom of will and control of our own destiny. Our destinies will be controlled primarily by what we call the global elite. It's going to be controlling all of this. Now, interestingly enough, who are the global elite? The answer is in Revelation 18. They're in verses 3 and 9, it's the kings of the earth. We'll talk about that in a moment in a little more detail. And also the merchants of the earth in verses 3 and 11. So what we see here is a literal fulfillment as this agenda comes into play, these public-private partnerships of actually fulfilling prophetic writings in Revelation 18. Now in verse 23 it says the merchants were the world's great men. You might ask yourself, well, where are the non-government organizations in this particular case? Well, let's go back to Revelation 17:16, where it says that the beast and the 10 horns that you saw, and I'll talk about the 10 horns in a moment, hate the prostitute, and they will bring her to ruin and leave her naked. By the end of what is called the tribulation, there will no longer be this false religion. It will be destroyed by the kings and the merchants. Interesting, isn't it? As we're seeing this unholy trinity evolve before our very eyes, we could potentially be seeing the fulfillment of prophecy. Now in Daniel 7:23, it says that when this is fully implemented, the angel gave Daniel this explanation, that the fourth beast is a fourth kingdom that will appear on earth. It will be different from all the other kingdoms and will devour the whole earth, trampling it down and crushing it. It's going to be an iron-fisted form of government in which you and I, as people or citizens of the earth, will have very, very limited choices as to what we can do. And will be totally dominated by this unholy trinity, at least during a portion of the time that they're in existence. And finally, by the merchants of the earth and the various kings. Now, is this happening? Well, very interestingly, we have the plan to rule the earth. Is this really happening? If we look at history, what we find is one of the greatest books ever published called Tragedy and Hope. It's 1,300 pages long. It was written in 1966. And it was written by Carol Quickly, professor of history at Georgetown University, one of the most notorious or the most highly respected historians in the 20th century. His work is impeccable. And what he is, he's an insider in with the global elite and had 3 years to investigate the actual records of the global elite as to how they actually did things. His book is literally astonishing, but it shows exactly what their intention is. It's not a conspiracy, it's a matter of history, and we need to recognize it from that standpoint. What we're seeing in Tragedy and Hope is primarily that the powers of financial capitalism, these are the private banks that we had been talking about earlier, had another far-reaching aim, nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. Going on with this particular quote, this system was to be controlled in a feudalistic fashion by the central banks of the world acting in concert by secret agreements. And that is, of course, exactly what we're seeing happening with these public-private partnerships. They are literally fascism coming to life in the most concrete terms that you can imagine. Finally, he goes on to say that the apex of this system was to be the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland, a private bank owned and controlled by the world's central banks, which were themselves private corporations. Now, the entire Monterey Conference on the financing sustainable development is referring back to constantly the Bank for International Settlements. Again, if you look at this video, Destiny 21st Century Towards Global Financial Control, what you'll find is that I trace much of the actual control that's going to be existing in this new financial or economic architecture of the world is going to be controlled by the Bank for International Settlements. Now, how close are we to actually seeing this happen? Very close, and we need to be very conscious of that. Zbigniew Brzezinski in 1999. Now, Zbigniew was the former National Security Advisor for President Carter and was the founder of the Trilateral Commission, one of the main globalist institutions in the world today. He basically said in 1999 again, it will be soon possible to assert almost continuous control over every citizen, and to maintain up-to-date files containing even the most personal details about health and personal behavior. Now, how are we going to do that? Is it even possible? Do we have the legal structure in the United States to allow that? Unfortunately, we do. With the passage of the Homeland Security Act on November 19, 2002, we have allowed bureaucrats to be able to track every financial transaction, every medical record, every event we attend, and every complaint by nosy neighbors. Everything. Now, is our government likely to do that? No, probably not initially, just like it never does on anything. But eventually, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. The law does allow them to do exactly this, and within a period of years, you're going to be able to see a continuously increasing exerting of control over you and I as they track us. Technologically, is it possible? Yes. With new technology, with microchip technology, we can actually, about the size of a dime, we can implant this in a person somewhere on his being and literally could track him anywhere in the world that he goes. Now, obviously, that's not going to happen for every single person, but if somebody starts to get out of control, what you're going to find is the ability to be able to track that individual anywhere where they can go. This microchip contains every transaction that they've ever committed, every medical record that they have, everything that they have ever done can be transmitted through the satellites and towers to a central organization where it can be processed, and they would know exactly what you're doing, and if you're not doing what they deem that you should do, they can control you. Now, that's a very alarming concept, isn't it? And yet, the Bible, when you look at Revelation 13, 16 through 18, says that he forced, the Antichrist, the beast, also forced everyone, small and rich, small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on his right hand or in his forehead. Could this be the microchip? We don't know, but it's very likely the technology now exists and it's only going to get better. In verse 17, so that no one could buy or sell unless he had the mark. The perfect mechanism controlling you. If you get out of hand, you're going to be terminated in the context that you cannot buy or sell anything, and you're going to starve to death unless you bow down to what they want you to do. And remember, they can track you anywhere in the world. Now let's take a look at the creation of economic regions. These are to be patterned after the European Union, where they have control over economic activity within their respective regions. This is the way it's being designed. First of all, we have the 10 kingdoms as envisioned by the Club of Rome. We've talked about this in previous videos. In fact, we go into it in a lot of detail in the final countdown to UN World Government, if you were interested in that particular video. And the first kingdom that was outlined in 1973 by the Club of Rome, now this is one of the most occultish organizations ever known by mankind, and yet it is probably the cream de cream of the global elite. North America was region or kingdom number 1. The European Union, as we know it today, was kingdom number 2. Kingdom number 3 at that time was Japan. Kingdom number 4 was a combination of South Africa and Australia. Kingdom number 5 was the Soviet Union. Kingdom number 6 was Central and South America. Kingdom number 7 was the Muslim North African states. And kingdom number 8 was the Central African states. Kingdom number 9 was the Southeast Asian area as well as the South Sea Islands. And kingdom number 10 was China. Now, interestingly, that seems to parallel exactly what is being described today. Today, what we're seeing in the Monterey Conference down in Mexico, the International Conference on Financing for Development, that they also have divided the world up into regions. The first region is the free trade zone of the Americas that President Bush is very actively presenting and advancing right now, both North and South America. This would be one of the regions, a little different than what happened in 1973, but not so much. Number 2, again, was the European Union. Number 3 is the Russian Federation. Now, the Russian Federation, most people don't recognize, was created on August 18th, 2000, when the Kursk submarine was sinking in the North Sea, when the news media was reporting President Putin, as vacationing down in the Black Sea. He was actually meeting with all of the former Soviet republics to form a Russian Federation that is patterned after the European Union. And it was well published, but the Western media did not pick it up. ASEAN is the 4th area that is dominated by China. Whether or not Japan is involved in this is too early to tell yet, but it's now taking form. The South Sea area in Australia is region number 5. We know this because several years ago when we had the East Timor rebellion and so forth, Australia was called on to put that down. Not the United States, not Europe. It was Australia that had that responsibility. And what we're seeing here, of course, is that the military responsibility goes right along with the economic responsibility. Number 6 is the Arab League that has been trying to get its act together now for a number of years. Number 7 was created in August of 2002. It's called the African Union, and it will become very much like the pattern after the European Union. Now, will all of these survive? There's only 7 of them. Will all of them survive exactly as planned right now? We don't think so. What is very likely to happen is that the free trade zone of the Americas and the African unions are not going to survive as a single entity. And what we'll see fundamentally is them dividing at least into 2, if not 3 areas. And so now, rather than 7, we have 9 economic regions. All we need is one more, and what we're going to find in Daniel 7:24 is that the 10 horns are 10 kings who come from this kingdom. In Revelation 17:12 through 13, it says that the 10 horns that you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received a kingdom, but who for 1 hour will receive authority as the kings along with the beast, or the Antichrist. He will have one purpose and will give their power and authority to the beast. Are we seeing that come about right now? We don't know. But we better be aware and better be knowledgeable and active and able to reach people with the knowledge that we could be in the very last days of planet Earth. Now, the one thing that they need to do in order to implement this agenda is to implement what is known as the Tobin tax, or some mechanism therein that will allow the United Nations to implement global governance by having independent taxation authority and not dependent upon the nation states that belong to it. Right now, the governments of the world provide about $1.5 trillion a year. I'm sorry, $1.5 billion a year. With the Tobin tax, which is a 0.1% tax on all international monetary exchanges, what we're going to see is literally about $1 trillion to $1.5 trillion a year income to the United Nations that is totally independent of the nation states that belong to the United Nations. Once that happens, the United Nations is free to pretty much do whatever it wants. Interestingly enough, that was a major agenda item at the Monterey Financial Conference, and one that was being pushed by a number of different nations in the world, primarily the European Union and Mexico and a number of others. President Bush stopped it. Basically said, we're not going to do that, and instead says the United States is going to contribute another $5 billion a year for development in impoverished or developing nations, totaling about $10 billion because we're already doing about $5 billion, and in the process derailed the entire Tobin tax effort. Now, we can congratulate President Bush in this process. We don't know why he did it, but at the same time, we're very thankful. And one of the things that we can literally do is thank God also that this particular tax was prevented, because that is something that is essential for them to advance this particular agenda, is to have independent taxation authority, and they did not get it. The third conference that we're going to look at that occurred in the year 2002 is the World Summit on Sustainable Development that was held in Johannesburg, South Africa, August 26th through September 4th, 2002. This was to be the culminating meeting of all the meetings over the last 30 years. This was going to pull everything together to install the actual control of global governance and give it to the United Nations. It was a critical meeting. What is sustainable development? The father of sustainable development is Stephen Rockefeller. Stephen Rockefeller is the son of Nelson Rockefeller and the great-grandson of David Rockefeller of the Rockefeller Empire. He is very much involved in the globalist activities that we've been talking about here tonight. And according to his vision of sustainable development, which is the United Nations vision of sustainable development, he basically says that sustainability calls for a fundamental transformation in how people behave. Changes in behavior can be assisted by laws and incentives to a new morality and a new moral concept of world order. Now, that's not exactly what you and I think about sustainable development. We think in a little bit more concrete terms that we don't want to do things today that is going to diminish the opportunities of future generations. This is the public idea of sustainable development, but the true idea is being promoted by Stephen Rockefeller behind the scenes, and this is the real agenda of the United Nations. Stephen Rockefeller goes on to say that sustainable by definition means not only indefinitely prolonged, but nourishing as the earth is nourishing to life and the self-actualization of persons and communities. Isn't that wonderful? It's a very New Age expression, a warm fuzzy, as it were, where we actually nourish the entire earth, including the rocks and the rivers, as we looked at earlier in this vision. The self-actualization of people, of course, is reaching their full human potential, eventually into reincarnating into ascended masters. The word development here need not be restricted to economic activity, but can mean the evolution, the unfolding, growth, and fulfillment of any and all aspects of life. Therefore, according to Stephen Rockefeller, sustainable development may be defined as the kind of human activity that nourishes and perpetuates the fulfillment of the whole community of life on earth, including the rocks and the rivers. This is their concept of sustainable development. Now do you begin to understand why I say that the implementation of the Earth Charter into policy that was supposed to happen at the World Summit on Sustainable Development would have caused a radical change in our standard of living if they actually were successful in getting this kind of definition into law. The major goals of the World Summit was basically to implement Agenda 21, to reduce the number of people in poverty by half by the year 2015, and to strengthen the role of major groups, i.e. the non-governmental organizations, corporate government partnerships that we've been talking about all evening. Let's take first Agenda 21. What is Agenda 21? I have really not talked too much about Agenda 21 in my previous books and videos. So let's just take a quick look at it because it will have major impacts on you and I. Agenda 21 is made up of a variety of different things, and the socialist concept of Agenda 21 is that they want to, and this involves several chapters, have the international cooperation to accelerate sustainable development in developing nations or countries. Now, the developing nations and countries are highly suspicious of sustainable development because they see it short-stopping their ability to develop their nations and to get themselves out of poverty. But yet the number one goal of Agenda 21 is to implement sustainable development in developing countries. They want to combat poverty through a socialist income redistribution and control of private property rights. They want a tremendous global income redistribution plan to take money from the developed nations, especially that of the United States, and give it to the developing nations, ostensibly to help them to develop. But in fact, what it will do, it won't help them to develop at all. It will just bring down the standard of living in the United States to their level. Why? The control of property rights. They also want to control or change consumption patterns, to limit buying and consuming to what is sustainable, of course, by United Nations definition, not by reality. And again, we have to define what is sustainable based on what the Earth's needs are, not what our needs are. The next one would be to change the demographic dynamics to be sustainable. We have been hearing for decades that the Earth is overpopulated, and the Convention on Biological Diversity demanded that we reduce human population by 75 to 85% and move people from rural to urban centers. This is one of the things that I helped present to the United States Senate the day that this treaty was to be ratified that helped it to be derailed. It was never ratified, and I'll explain more in just a moment. They also want to protect and promote human health through massive socialist healthcare systems patterned after that of Hillary Clinton back in 1994, where the government controls and tells you what kind of health privileges you can have and what kind you cannot have. It's going to be totally governmental control of our healthcare system. And finally, to promote sustainable human settlements through the high-rise development, lots of green space and within walking distance of employment and shopping. This has been the envisioning of the Habitat 1 and 2 United Nations conferences over the last 30 years, where everybody has to live within walking distance because basically we're going to eliminate the automobile, which of course, according to them, is a tragic polluter, causes global warming and so forth. I'm not going to get into that. Again, if you want to know more about that, get our final countdown on UN World Government that you see right here. The fact is, however, that this is what they want to do is a major move on yours and my part to get us to where we're within walking distance or bicycle distance of where we work and shop. And of course, develop policy for sustainable development. And it's not going to be development by you and I where we participate. It's going to be development by the United Nations and the global elite. This is who is going to define the policy, not you and I. We're left out of the circle entirely. This 40-chapter document, this massive document, the next step is the conservation and management of resources for development. The first step in this is to protect the atmosphere, or what they call the energy transition. They're basically saying that we actually consume far too much energy, put too much carbon dioxide into our atmosphere. And the Kyoto Protocol, for instance, had it been implemented, had President Bush not pulled us out of that very, very damning treaty, would have reduced U.S. energy consumption by up to 30%. It was a horrifying treaty, one in which, even at the best, the United Nations admits, would only have reduced global warming by about 0.15 degrees over the next 50 years. It would have had almost no effect whatsoever. And yet it would have bankrupted the United States. Again, this was another one of their massive income redistribution plans because the Kyoto Protocol only affects the developed nations, and it would be the developed nations like the United States that would have to buy pollution credits from the developing nations in order to continue our industry and our resources and so forth. And again, income redistribution, buying pollution credits that we don't even need to buy. The next step would be to integrate the approach to land use resource, and they have envisioned right now dividing the country up into 18 different watershed basins. Each of these basins would have its own public-private partnership to decide what gets to be funded and what doesn't get to be funded. Since it crosses state lines, even international lines, we have these public-private partnerships deciding on what to do because they're not within state boundaries or county boundaries or even national boundaries. And therefore, we need these public-private partnerships. But these public-private partnerships are not elected by the people, and therefore they're not accountable to the people. They want to combat deforestation primarily through preventing forest harvesting. And of course, in the last several years, we've seen the disastrous impact of non-harvesting on our nation's forests by the huge forest fires that have occurred, and of course that's only going to accentuate if they actually implement this particular agenda. They also want to meet agricultural needs without destroying the land. Now, how are you going to do that? How are you going to clear a field, for instance, and plant corn and so forth and raise it intensively for fruit production if you're not supposed to hurt the environment? Well, you can't. And what they have outlined is basically eliminating all pesticides, all fertilizers, even though they acknowledge in the literature that in doing so they will reduce the human food production by 1/2. And now you're beginning to see, of course, why they think that we need to eliminate 75 to 85% of the human population over the next 50 years, because there's not going to be enough food. They also want to sustain biological diversity, and one of the principal things of the Convention on Biological Diversity was to actually carve up the United States and other nations around the world into wilderness areas, what they call reserves and interconnecting corridors that are basically wilderness areas where no human being sets foot. That's what you're seeing in red in this map, where basically the rivers, the streams, huge areas will be off limits to human activity. It will occupy between 30 to 50% of any land base. And this is what the Convention on Biological Diversity would have done. I had created this map, had been working on it for a number of years, actually sent it down to the U.S. Senate the day before the ratification vote was to be held. And when it was found out that that's exactly what the United Nations intended to do, what the treaty actually did, it was only an 18-page treaty. None of the implementing language had been written. And as a consequence, the Senate didn't know what it was voting on. But when we showed them both this map as well as the documentation called the Global Biodiversity Assessment, it became very clear what the United Nations intended to do was basically to move people off of the land, force them into developed areas, cities, urban areas, and so forth, and that would require a reduction in human population by 75 to 85%. Astonishing. The treaty was not ratified, and we have primarily to thank because we got this document serendipitously from Europe just before the ratification vote was to occur so we could prove it to the United States Senate. The next area would be to safeguard our oceans, resources. We're not going to talk too much about that tonight. And then the next one would be protect and manage freshwater resources, which basically includes the Clean Water Initiative that was started by Al Gore in 1997, where we have divided the American landscape up into 2,100 different watersheds, half of which are in red or orange or yellow, that are going to have direct federal intervention to control land use activities to protect these watersheds. This is not something that I'm just speculating on. This is happening right now as we speak. There are several lawsuits in process. We don't know how they're going to turn out, but the fact is that we have divided the landscape up into 2,100 different watersheds, half of which are going to receive immediate federal intervention, again by public-private partnerships because they crossed jurisdictional lines of counties and states. The American Heritage Rivers Program was a dream of President Clinton's, in which he had nominated 14 rivers to be heritage rivers. The last two in the southern Mississippi Valley were nominated just moments before he made the announcements, because by doing so, if you look at the actual literature of the American Heritage Rivers Program, what you will find is that all of the watersheds that are linked to the particular river in which they're involved in as a heritage river, all of those come under federal control as well. So not only do we see the red watersheds that are directly abounding the rivers, the heritage rivers themselves, but the pink watersheds also tie in to those rivers and those watersheds. Therefore, they're involved. And finally, by nominating those last two at the last moment in the southern part of the Mississippi Basin, what he has done is basically controlling the entire Mississippi River Basin, which is over half of the land area of the United States. Comes under now federal land use control jurisdiction. All with public-private partnerships, totally bypassing the electoral process of the people. The last one is ecosystem management. Ecosystem management has divided the landscape up into 46 different ecosystems of the United States. Again, this one is not as advanced. They're looking at the Columbia River Interior Basin area up in the Pacific Northwest as the lead area, in which they're trying to implement right now. That's running into a lot of resistance, but nonetheless, it is again based in public-private partnerships as the form of governance, not the electoral process that has made this nation great. And then there's a number of other things concerning the environment with Agenda 21 that I'm not going to get into today. Again, the 40 chapters also talks about the strengthening role of major groups, the public-private partnerships that we've been talking about all evening. President Clinton basically has implemented those behind the scenes during his administration. The goals then of the World Summit on Sustainable Development can be classified in 5 primary areas. The reduction of poverty, the further development of public-private partnerships, the solidification of the concept of sustainable development, the acceptance of the Earth Charter as a guiding principle for all peoples of the world, and finally, the unifying the nations to ratify the Covenant on Environment and Development, which was written in 1995, but was to be introduced to the world at the World Summit on Sustainable Development as the mechanism to implement sustainable development that is based on the pantheistic principles of the Earth Charter. This is what they wanted to do in these 5 goals of the World Summit. Now, the World Summit agenda item number 1, reduce poverty. Interestingly enough, how they want to reduce poverty, again, is an income redistribution plan. To the developed nations, transfer 3 to 5% of the gross national product or the gross domestic product to impoverished nations. This is their plan on reducing poverty. It's not to create wealth in the nations, it's to take it from the developed nations and give it to the non-developed nations. Classic socialist concept. They can't think out of the box. The other side of the issue is that they want to control all land use activities. Why? In Habitat 1, held in Vancouver in 1976, it says that land cannot be treated as an ordinary asset controlled by individuals. In other words, the United Nations position all along has been that private property rights are not good for the people or for the world. It goes on to say that private land ownership is also a principal instrument of accumulation and concentration of wealth and contributes to social injustice. It finally says that if unchecked, it may become a major obstacle in, I'm going to insert the word United Nations, but in the United Nations planning of development schemes, or sustainable development schemes. In other words, these socialists want to literally plan our economy and our lives. Only they have the wisdom necessary to make the world a utopia. That's exactly what this is trying to do. It goes on by saying that the provision of decent dwellings and healthy conditions for the people can only be achieved if land is used in the interest of society as a whole. The whole concept of the public good, that the public good outweighs the needs of the individual, and therefore the state needs to control private property rights, not the individual. And finally, it says that the public control of land use is therefore indispensable. Later on in Habitat 1, it talks about public ownership or effective control of land in public interest is the single most important means of achieving a more equitable distribution of benefits of development. In other words, only they can actually create and plan an economy that is going to benefit us all. It can't be individuals acting in their own best interest. It has to be controlled by them. Finally, governments must maintain a full jurisdiction and exercise complete sovereignty over such land. Change in the use of land should be subject to public control and regulation of the common good. Isn't that interesting? That again, the socialist concept of land use control prevails in this document in all the United Nations activities since 1976 when this was written. It is literally a program to take our private property away from us and give it to the state, ultimately the United Nations under global governance. Now, will this work? Can individuals who are enlightened actually plan an economy that is better than the individuals acting individually but in concert? Unfortunately, the answer is no. And the final proof of that came from Hernando de Soto in his book, The Mystery of Capital, in the year 2001. Hernando de Soto was given $26 million to determine why capitalism failed in the developing nations and the former communist bloc nations of the world. Why has capitalism failed so utterly? They tried literally everything of capitalism to bring up and to instill capitalism in these nations, and it failed utterly. And the people are worse off now than they were before, and they hate the whole concept of capitalism. Why did it fail? And that's the answer that he was paid to find. And what he found is private property rights are the absolute key to wealth creation. Without it, you will not be able to create wealth. And of course, none of these socialist-based nations had private property rights, nor were they willing to give it to their citizens. And instead, what we find that in these developing nations, it takes 10 to 20 years to register property ownership, going through, in some cases, 2 to 3 or 400 individual bureaucratic steps over a period of 10 to 20 to 25 years in order to get the property registered. Here in the United States, in the Western civilization, in the Western world, we buy and sell land. We sell our homes. It's registered within a couple of days, matter of hours in some cases. And we have a liquid form of capital available to us in our land ownership. Interestingly enough, even in the United States, the Heritage Foundation has done a study. It shows that the equity value of an average homeowner in the United States is $134,000. The average value of a renter in the United States is $4,000. Really driving the point home of how important private property rights really are and their ability to legally generate some capital asset value. Property rights are never really established in these developing nations in the former Soviet Union, yes, or these former communist nations. Yes, what we see in this particular situation is that locally they may own their house and a piece of property that's recognized by the local community, but is not legally established, and therefore it has no asset value. And they cannot borrow money against it. 70% of all the small businesses in the United States are started by people borrowing against their home in order to develop the capital necessary to start their business. These developing nations don't have that. It's not available to them. It's called dead capital, according to Hernando de Soto. It has no equity value for capital investment. Interestingly enough, that de Soto estimates that there is $9.3 trillion in dead capital worldwide. $9.3 trillion in dead capital. This is capital that is there, but they have no access to it for capital investment. Now that is 93 times more than all the foreign aid ever given, and 46 times all the loans ever given by the World Bank. Interestingly enough, these nations don't need development money from the developed nations like the United States. They already have asset value, except by limiting property rights through regulations and their socialist agendas. They have destroyed that asset value and kept their people in poverty. And that's exactly what the United Nations version of sustainable development is designed to do. Tragically, this concept will never get these nations out of poverty. But look what happens. When I was down in South Africa attending the World Summit on Sustainable Development, in the 1990s, before the apartheid revolution in South Africa, we had shanty towns that were very similar to all those shanty towns in the rest of the world, where people lived in absolute squalor, in cardboard huts, in corrugated iron huts, where sewer was running down the streets, where they pirated electricity off of the nearest transmission line. This is very typical of what you see all the way around the world in these developing nations in these shanty towns that do not have property rights. But Nelson Mandela, and many of you think that he's an extreme socialist and was very bad for the country, but even the whites in South Africa respect that man because of what he did. He developed the Rural Development Program, which basically gave property rights to all of these shanty owners, and they now have about a half an acre apiece, a quarter to a half acre apiece, and look what's happened in 5 years. In 5 years. It is astonishing what has happened in 5 years. Once these people got the actual title free and clear to their property, they immediately had the pride of ownership. And they began to clean up their act. The government did put in sewer and water as well as electricity, but they have to pay for it, just like you and I do. And they have taken so much pride that in this particular case, yes, the home is still made out of corrugated iron. But look to the left, you can barely see it, but that home is made out of brick. And what happens is that when they finally accumulate enough wealth, they will convert their corrugated shack into a brick home. In any event, that sidewalk is clean enough that you can eat off of it. This is what the pride of ownership can do. And it happened within a 5-year period. It can be no other reason why we've seen this phenomenon. And when you have the work of Hernando de Soto in the Mystery of Capital, in the book that he wrote, what you see literally is that private property rights is the key, absolute key essential into developing wealth in a nation. If you do not have it, you will not have wealth. And we now have an ever increasingly socialist government that is trying to grab more and more property rights and turning us into basically a third world nation without property rights. And that's what we're heading for. And what we saw in South Africa, wherever we turned, was hope. These people had hope in some cases for the first time in their life. Yes, they've got a long, long ways to go. It's not going to be instantaneous success and wealth. But they have hope now because they've been given the tools to do it. United Nations Sustainable Development can never, ever reduce poverty because it's doing the very thing that destroys wealth by private property and human incentive, by destroying private property and human incentive. It is literally astonishing that the very thing that they're trying to implement to reduce wealth will actually destroy that ability and put them into even deeper abject poverty. And they want to do it to you and I as well. Agenda item number 2 for the World Summit was the public-private partnerships. Now, we've talked about them all night. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. But 26 major and 124 minor partnerships were established. And we need to be conscious of those. They're not all bad, but establishes a form of governance that is independent of the people. And for that reason, we need to be very cautious of it. Agenda item number 3 is to solidify the United Nations Sustainable Development. Interestingly enough, as I mentioned earlier, the people that attended this were very suspicious of sustainable development because it seemed to correctly, as it turns out, seemed to undermine their very efforts in creating development and the ability to get themselves out of poverty. We were involved in a small demonstration on one day when we were down there, and this is the type of activity we saw, where they wanted the freedom to trade. They didn't want aid, they wanted the ability to trade. They wanted the ability to be able to prosper and not have government control. This is the key. This is what they recognized. They understood the principle better than most Americans. Agenda item number 4, to accept the Earth Charter as the guiding principle. It started out that way. We saw the Ark of Hope displayed very prominently at the meeting, and there was major efforts to actually put it on, to actually incorporate it in the final resolution so it would be now sanctioned by the United Nations to be the guiding principle for development in the future. Interestingly enough, again, what we're seeing in Stephen Rockefeller's final report, that in the closing days of the summit, the first draft of the Johannesburg Declaration of Sustainable Development included recognition of the relevance of the changes posed in the Earth Charters. In other words, they got what they wanted into the final resolution. But something happened. He said that on the last day of the summit, in closed-door negotiations, the reference to the Earth Charter was deleted. Why? Because we had been working, along with many other people, with the delegation from the United States that was down there, from the Bush administration. And they already knew it. It wasn't something we were telling. We told them about Hernando de Soto. We told them about the need for property rights. And what they did, what the delegation did, was force the removal of the Earth Charter off of this final resolution because they recognized the danger that it imposed. Again, we thwarted the global agenda. It was an astonishing thing, but the Earth Charter never made it on the actual final resolution. The agenda item number 5 was to unify the nations to ratify the Covenant on the Environment and Development, this overall enabling treaty that was ready to be introduced to the world during the World Summit. Something happened on the way. And what we see is disunity, not that unity prevailed. And what happened, it was so bad that British Deputy Prime Minister John Prescott warned that if we fail here, things would unravel on a scale that we have not seen before in international negotiations. Because of this disunity, because of the mistrust on developing nations that we helped create, because of the Bush administration understanding that wealth is generated by private property rights, not by socialist control, the Covenant on the Environment and Development was not even introduced. It never even made the light of day at the summit. And as a consequence, what they'd hoped to do to wrap up 30 years worth of work did not happen. And what we saw at the meeting was that the summit failed to accomplish the goals that it had set itself out to accomplish. The global agenda was at least temporarily derailed. Don't get the impression that it's been derailed once and for all. They'll recover and they'll come at us from a different direction. But the culminating meeting, the World Summit on Sustainable Development, where all this was supposed to come together, did not succeed. Why? Well, in Daniel 2:41 through 43, we find that just as you saw that the feet and the toes were partly of baked clay and partly of iron, so this will be a divided kingdom. Yet it will have some of the strength of iron in it, just as we've seen before, even as you saw iron mixed with clay. As the toes were partly mixed, partly iron and partly clay, so this kingdom will be partly strong and partly brittle. And just as you saw that the iron mixed with baked clay, so that the people will be a mixture and will not remain united any more than iron mixes with clay. And that's exactly what we saw at the World Summit on Sustainable Development. Now the international community and the global elite are going to have to figure out a way in which they can force this together, because it's not coming together naturally. It never can come together naturally. They're going to have to try to force it with an iron fist, but even when they do, it's not going to remain totally united. We're going to see these kinds of setbacks right along the way. Now, interestingly, we have to recognize that God is always in control. And in Psalms 2:1 through 4, it says, God always wins. Why do the nations conspire and the people plot in vain? The kings of the earth take their stand, and the rulers gather together against the Lord and against his anointed one, which is Jesus Christ. And he says, the world says, let us break their chains and let us throw off their fetters. And the one enthroned in heaven laughs, and the Lord scoffs at them. You know, this world government, assuming we're in the end times, we don't know if we're in the end times, but they're trying to establish a world government just as described in the end times literature and prophecies of the Bible. And even if, as they move to do that, if it's not in God's timing, it will not happen. He will derail it using different people just like you and I. I happen to be one of 4 people that helped derail the Convention on Biological Diversity an hour before that treaty was to be ratified. It never got done and set them back by a couple of years. You can be involved in this too, but you need to find out what God wants you to do. In the process, you need to be doing it. It may be nothing more than sweeping the halls of the church or whatever, or maybe taking a more active role in some capacity. But all of us individually have a responsibility. When we come together corporately, we can be instruments of God, and we can be part of the solution and not part of the problem. Good night.